Support comes from Seattle Rep, presenting the return of The Play That Goes Wrong, back by popular demand this June. This award-winning comedy follows the Cornley Drama Society as their production unravels with missed cues, collapsed scenery, and onstage mishaps. Performances begin June 11th on the Bagley Wright stage. Tickets and information at seattlerep.org.
You know, every day on Up First, NPR's Golden Globe-nominated morning news podcast, we bring you three essential stories. At the heart of each story are questions. What really happened? What really mattered? What happens next? At NPR, we stand for your right to be curious and to follow the facts. Follow Up First wherever you get your podcasts and start your day knowing what matters and why.
Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, the Yankee Sphinx, a nickname I did not know he had until reading the novel of the same name by Mark Frost. Mark is probably best known for co-creating this little thing called Twin Peaks with David Lynch, but it turns out he's also an author of titles that include Game 6, Cincinnati, Boston in the 1975 World Series, and The List of Seven, a novel that is way more up my alley about a young Arthur Conan Doyle who teams up with a mysterious man to fight a satanic cult in Victorian London. Awesome. Mark's latest novel is not that, but it is a fascinating look at FDR's time in office, starting with the attack on Pearl Harbor from the diaries of one of FDR's closest confidants. Mark was in town on tour recently and was kind enough to stop by the studio to speak with me. Mark, hello.
Good morning. How are you, Katie?
I'm so well. How about yourself?
I'm doing really well. For somebody who just flew in last night at midnight.
I'm so sorry about that.
That's
but
quite
thank
all
you
right.
for being here with us. And we're kind of gonna get this out of the way. There's not a lot of Twin Peaks talk happening in this novel, Mark, but I think people will enjoy it nonetheless.
Well, I think it could tangentially be considered to be part of the Twin Peaks universe.
Ooh.
And there's an Easter egg in the book, if people want to look for it, where they might find a connection.
Yes, there is, but we're not going to spoil any of that. Now, Mark, when I was pitched this latest novel, I was like, okay, heck yeah, let's get weird. But you're not really the weird guy from Twin Peaks. That's more your friend David, right? Is that fair?
Well, it's like saying, John was the weird Beatle. We're both weird, or we were, but in different ways. And I'm weird more in a Paul kind of way.
Sure. Okay, that's fair.
Is that fair?
Yeah, I think so. A little more grounded.
A little bit. Plenty of the supernatural and transcendental, this, that, and the other thing. You bring it on.
So we are talking about the Yankee Sphinx, your latest novel. And so it is labeled an FDR novel, like that's a specific and common subgenre or series or something. And so when I did see that, I was like, okay, let's get weird with FDR. But it's not really weird, is it? It dives really deeply into him as a person.
Yes, and it's based initially and almost entirely on a diary that was kept during World War II by this fellow, William Hassett, who was started as his correspondence secretary in 1934, but was consistently with him and became his closest associate and appointment secretary during the war years. He was a trained journalist, and when the war began, FDR was under a security blackout in terms of reporting and his whereabouts. So as somebody who was trained to keep an eye on history, Will began keeping a diary of all of his movements, all of his meetings, all of their private conversations, and they had hundreds of them. And that diary was then published in 1958 to great acclaim. And a historian as august as Doris Kearns Goodwin told me, this diary is the greatest window that we have into the actual character of who FDR was as a person underneath the opaque kind of Mount Rushmore figure, implacable and sturdy, that everyone knew. There was a living, breathing human being in there. He just chose not to show that to too many people. Hence the nickname that Harry Hopkins gave him. He used to call him the damn Yankee Sphinx because no one could figure out what he was thinking. He played his cards close to the vest. But Will, who had grown up Roman Catholic and very poor in Vermont and become a journalist, actually studied in the seminary with the thought of becoming a priest, had this very mild confessional manner. FDR's nickname for him was the Bishop. Mm-hmm. And so they would have wonderfully wide-reaching and long, intimate conversations about things that I really haven't been able to find that FDR talked about with anyone else.
Why did it feel like the right time now to revisit this diary and in this particular way to fictionalize it as you have?
I should mention that Will was my great-granduncle. And I knew him as a little boy. I met him a number of times. And on my 11th birthday, the year before he died, he gave me a copy of that diary that had been published in 1958. And I carried it with me all my life. I didn't really comprehend it until I was in my 20s. I can't say it was the first thing I read, but I always felt there was a story and a book. Well, originally I thought it was going to be a play in telling the story of Will's years with this remarkable man. And as it turned out, the last 10 years are the years I've been working on it. I was in New York City on Election Day in 2016, and a certain New York resident was having his so-called victory party across the street from my hotel. I woke up the next day and it was dismal and raining and as brutal a feeling as I could recall. I wasn't there on 9/11, but it was certainly a cousin of that feeling. And I didn't know what to do. The one thing that you have that you can offer people is a voice and a point of view. And I thought, well, maybe this is the time to call the FDR library, which I did that morning. And the librarian fortunately knew who I was. And she certainly knew who my uncle was because he was one of the original trustees of the library and its first director.
Wow.
So I drove up the next day, and the treasure trove of material they had on Will and the two of them together was extraordinary. And I walked out of there that day knowing that was going to be my next project.
How much of the book is Hassett's original diary writings and how much of it is you?
Well, I was fortunate in that I had not just the diaries to work from. I had all of his personal papers and all of his correspondence that's not in the diary.
Right.
And I actually, in the process of writing this book, I discovered a whole set of cousins I didn't know I had who had all of his personal papers and effects and were kind enough to give them to me. And it's wonderful to always meet long-lost family members.
Yeah.
So everything in there is pretty well sourced. Either it's something that I knew he was thinking, or it's something that was said. And then it's just about, how do you arrange all these things artfully in a way that makes the story compelling, but is also true to the reality of what they were all feeling and living through.
I specifically think when I ask this question about this exchange, maybe halfway through the book, when Hassett is talking to FDR's daughter, Anna, about a dinner guest, a woman who FDR had an affair with. And in the course of that conversation, Anna heavily implies not only that her mother, Eleanor Roosevelt, has had relationships with other women, but she also suggests that FDR is aware of that. How much of that is true?
As near as I can tell, all of it.
Wow.
I mean, the Roosevelts were split apart as a couple by this affair that happened in the late teens. Franklin was then the Undersecretary of the Navy, his first national government post. And he and Eleanor and their 5 kids were in Washington for the first time. And she had hired an appointment secretary because she was going a little nuts with all of the responsibilities of a marriage to a cabinet officer, but also a mother to 5.
Right.
And she hired this lovely young Virginian woman, Lucy Mercer, who became like the nanny to all the kids and indispensable to them as a family. And then one summer, while Eleanor and the 5 kids were up in their compound in Maine, something happened between Franklin and Lucy, and they fell in love. And that was just the truth of it. there was going to be a divorce. This is all told in the book, and there's
Yes.
a remarkable scene with Franklin's mother,
Mm-hmm.
who had a different opinion about how this should go down. And let's just say it was very influential in terms of how the rest of the 20th century unfolded.
Right.
So that's historical fact. We know that this happened. What most people don't know is that Lucy then married, and actually an acquaintance of FDR's, a very wealthy widower with a couple of children who needed help and care. They were a devoted couple for the next 22 years or so. And they surreptitiously, even though Eleanor had said, you must never speak to this woman again, that was one of her conditions about staying in the marriage, they would attend all of Franklin's inaugurals, for instance. And when her husband died, Franklin and his old friend Lucy, they'd been corresponding for a while. They were friends. They did what you do for a friend. You comfort them when they have a loss. And they found that he was already growing much weaker, but that being together was enormously helpful to his, let's say, soul, because it gave him a component of a loving, attuned friendship that he didn't necessarily have anywhere else.
Right.
So Anna, who's a remarkable woman,
Yeah.
and is deeply undervalued by history, I believe, steps up and into this very volatile breach, and she and Will help facilitate these meetings with Lucy. And Anna later says, I did this because I thought it was helping to keep him alive. And I believe she was right.
Yeah. I think that's what's so incredible about this novel as a whole is you learn about someone like FDR in your history textbook, and they almost feel centuries in the past because they're so big and what they did was so key to the shaping of the country. And to get insight from people so close to him, his daughter, from Will, it makes them human again. What was that like for you to go back into these documents that your own family played such a role in compiling, to be that close to history and see the person form right before your eyes?
It was a magical experience.
Yeah.
Creating the play was one thing because that was more a third-person kind of point of view, and everybody was represented. And it was enormously helpful in that it helped me to find everyone's voice because they're all distinct. And in fact, everything that was in the play is literally in the book.
Yeah.
But what was missing was the voice of the storyteller. And because he was a relative of mine and because I knew him, and he was somebody I deeply respected, and he himself was deeply loved and respected by the people who knew him, it's almost an act of, I hate to use the word spiritualism, but it's almost like having a seance and bringing these people into your mind and breathing life into them again. And at a certain point, and I've had this experience with a number of books I've done about real people, they start to speak to me. I don't feel like I'm just making up the words. I feel like they're coming from somewhere. Now, that may just be my own lunacy, and the fact that I've been doing this for so long.
It's that little bit of weird in you.
It's a little bit of weird.
Yeah.
And what was remarkable to me, during the course of writing the novel itself, I also learned that Sarah Delano Roosevelt was my sixth cousin.
Oh, wow.
So I'm distantly related to that family as well.
And
I
Sarah's
had
FDR's mother.
His mother, yeah. I mean, I had no idea. So there I am writing these scenes, and it's not just a president talking to his secretary. It's two of my relatives. It was bizarre, to make that connection.
That's such a good word for it. It is bizarre,
Yeah.
and it comes through with so much life. But another thing I learned was that FDR's daughter, Anna, and her husband ran the Seattle Post-Intelligencer in the late 1930s, early 1940s. That's incredible.
I know.
I guess I should have expected like a little bit of Pacific Northwest in this book, but did you know that, or does this region just kind of follow you?
It follows me around. I didn't know that when I started out. I did know that Anna knew Will when she was a young woman,
Right.
growing up in the Roosevelt household because Will was around a lot. And she wanted to be a reporter when she grew up. So there's a wonderful moment that they both recall where she asked her father if she could ask Will a few questions about becoming a journalist. So in a way, he kind of helped encourage her in that direction. And she did become, she and her husband, John Betticher was his name. He was the editor. She was the editor of the Woman's Page. She had a column that at times was nationally syndicated. And they spent, I think, 5 or 6 years here running that paper very successfully for William Randolph Hearst, not one of the greatest lovers of Roosevelt democracy who ever walked the earth. So she had that journalistic training and those instincts. And so she and Will bonded over that. And I believe that was one of the reasons she trusted him enough to take him so fully into her confidence.
Yeah, those instincts come through towards the end of the book as FDR's health is waning. And that instinct comes in when she starts to notice that something's not quite right. And that I will also not spoil anything. Although I guess there's a lot of history there. So as we've mentioned, the book is not very Twin Peaksy, if you will, but FDR in a weird way feels like a character you could have created. Even that name, the Yankee Sphinx, feels like someone you and David Lynch might have come up with, some mysterious agent of who knows what. So who was FDR to you ultimately, and why did he make such a compelling character?
I grew up because of the influence of my great uncle, and particularly on my dad, who was very close to him. And my dad's actually in the book. There's another connection to Twin Peaks. Doc Hayward, later, as a young sailor about to go off to take part in D-Day, visits the White House, and that's a wonderful moment. I grew up in a house where we called ourselves Roosevelt Democrats into the 60s and 70s. That was an identity and a priority to us because that we felt was the best that America had to offer. My dad had gone to college on the GI Bill. That was FDR's work. Yeah. They both benefited from Social Security and Medicare, both innovations of FDR's. FDR was the greatest innovator of dragging America forward out of the Gilded Age into something closer to actual democracy as a way of getting us out of the Great Depression. This was his solution. And he did it with unerring instincts. You know, he had a very different vision for how the war should go because by the time it got around to that point, it was England against all of Nazi Germany, which had conquered all of Europe. So his priorities were different. And Franklin had to figure out a way to work Churchill around to his point of view because he couldn't act unilaterally. He had built a coalition of what he called the United Nations, which obviously later became the United Nations, but 53 different countries took part in the fight against fascism. What a contrast to today. He led them brilliantly, and his sort of natural diplomacy and his way of understanding how to respect and promote and create alliances and coherence and consensus is unmatched, I think. So your question was about the man underneath. The man that came through to me, I realized he was a golden boy growing up. He was the only son of an extremely wealthy, old aristocratic family. He had no reason to have any democratic impulses whatsoever. But his family, were Democrats. It was Teddy's clan. They were cousins, and that's where Eleanor came from. Teddy was her uncle. They came from Long Island. They were much more exuberantly capitalists and Republicans. And they looked down their noses a little bit at those idealistic Hyde Park Democrats. But Franklin needed a little to be sort of brought to his knees a little bit by life as well. And that happened when he caught polio in 1921. And his life was virtually atomized by this event. He spent years in a kind of personal and political wilderness, hoping, praying for a cure that didn't exist until he happened upon this little rundown resort rehabilitation center in Warm Springs, Georgia, that had these hot mineral pools where polio sufferers could find relief and a way to gently exercise those muscles and save them a little bit from atrophying at the same rate. And when this patrician Yankee aristocrat found himself in these pools with all of these poor sharecroppers and all of these farmers who had lost their farms and all of these kids who were working in shops when they were 10 years old, he suddenly, I think, had something like an enlightenment experience.
Yeah.
And he became somebody who, after this event, said, I want to do this to be of service to other people. Mm-hmm. And that's how he spent the next 17 years of his life.
And I think those are the moments in the novel that like give you pause. You reflect on history a little differently. You feel that you know FDR that much better. And yet, both you and Hassett acknowledge that he is still, to the end of his days, the Sphinx. And he, in a weird way, lets people in but still keeps this boundary up. You said earlier that Hassett gives this window into who FDR is, but that window is still a little foggy.
It is, because he didn't finally let anyone all the way in.
Right.
It was just who he was. I would say he was a man whose destiny was almost foretold.
Yeah.
And he sensed it in a weird way. He was a man of enormous faith. He was Episcopalian. He never talked about it, but he acted from it. And he felt a kind of almost supernatural commitment to seeing this war through to the end. He took it as his personal responsibility, and he and many others in the administration, as Anna later puts it in the book, they gave their lives to this cause and this fight as surely as any poor kid who ever lost their life at Normandy or North Africa or, crossing the Rhine.
Yeah. Well, and folks will have to read the book to see how exactly that plays out in his personal life and for those around him, rather. But one other question that I want to ask, because you've mentioned the present a couple of times, because it is hard to imagine someone keeping a diary today like Hassett did then for a lot of reasons, but particularly because of the nature of his relationship with the president. And early in the book, Hassett is reflecting on FDR and what makes him tick. And Hassett / you write this: you won't see it in a job description, but presidents serve as our proxies for every joy and grievance in the cauldron of the national psyche. How we feel about these individuals reveals just as much about how the country feels about itself. What changes is the name of the man in the chair. The wheel turns, seasons of democratic ritual follow. The current occupant either sticks around for a second dance or is shown the door, making way for the next cockeyed, ambitious party hack who's in over his head. And I love that, and I wrote in my notes, I wonder if Hassett, or you for that matter, would write something like that about the current occupant of the Oval Office.
I'm sure Will would have very choice words for the current occupant and for the people who put him there. One of the things I hope the book will do is give us some context for where America has been and who we've been in terms of creating. Look, we're not perfect, and no one should pretend that we are. We've made terrible errors of judgment. But in terms of the democratic ideals that the country was based on, even if we haven't consistently lived up to them in many categories, show me a country that has. Show me a country that had the idea to begin with and then audaciously tried to instill it. I mean, as flawed as it was, there were things baked into that original 13 colonies that have caused all the problems ever since, and we know what they are. They're not hard to identify. But that's the world as it was then. We're in a different world now. And I believe that what we've seen as forward motion in our democracy in the last, it's lurching, it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. It's a question of reform and then a reactionary reaction to reform. That's been the pattern our entire existence. We're in a particularly bad reactionary swing back the other way right now. But it's not the first time it's happened, and it's not going to last. That's the comfort I take from having a historical perspective. It's by any measure, we've fallen very far, very fast from the best principles that we, if we live up to them, have meant some good in the world. The things that I've seen in the last year of people responding to this kind of continuous nightmare of incompetence and terror and impulsive, reckless behavior gives me hope.
Yeah.
I used to live in Minneapolis, and I know that community really well. And I believe when the history books are written, we're going to think about what happened there as something akin to what happened at Lexington and Concord in terms of its long-term impact. And I now hope that we will follow that same line from Lexington to Concord to a happier tomorrow sometime in the not-too-distant future.
Well, Mark, I have one last thing for you. You know that feeling when you've just finished a book that takes you back in time, makes you rethink history, you're kind of bathed in this picture of the past and you want to stay there, or maybe you want to rewrite it just a little. So you need another good book or a movie or a TV show or something to stay in that picture of the past and eventually get home to the present, maybe when you're ready. This is recommended if you liked The Yankee Sphinx and Historical Fiction with Mark Frost.
Support comes from Seattle Rep, presenting the return of The Play That Goes Wrong, back by popular demand this June. This award-winning comedy follows the Cornley Drama Society as their production unravels with missed cues, collapsed scenery, and onstage mishaps. Performances begin June 11th on the Bagley Wright stage. Tickets and information at seattlerep.org.
Seattle Now is your one-stop shop for local news, twice a day, every weekday. We give you a deep dive into a story for your morning routine and a roundup of the day's top stories for your commute home, and some laughs every Friday. Hosted by me, Patricia Murphy, and Paige Browning. Start and end your day with Seattle Now on the KUOW app or wherever you get your podcasts.
Well, when times are tough, find your place of safety, find your place of comfort. There's plenty of good art and storytelling and wisdom out there. I find great solace myself in the works of the Stoic philosophers, Marcus Aurelius, Seneca. There are ways in which you have to take care of yourself first at times like this. Mm-hmm. Anybody who's been through nightmares knows that that's your first responsibility. Art and storytelling are a big help with that. There's a great movie that I loved last year, Sentimental Value, directed by the wonderful Joachim Trier, who's had a long and distinguished career, but I really think this is his masterwork, starring the great Stellan Skarsgård in a career-defining role about an aging, once thought of as great film director who is trying to late in life make a bit of a comeback with a script he's been working on for years, and he's estranged from his two daughters, both in very different ways. Beautiful performances by all of them, stunning performances, and he's hoping to reconcile with one of his daughters, who's an extraordinary actress, who has not wanted to work with her father because of issues that have come up between them over the years. So he basically says, okay, I'm going to hire an actress from Hollywood. Mm-hmm. And the wonderful Elle Fanning comes in and plays this actress who's going to try to fill that part and fill that hole. I won't give too much away, except to say the way in which all these things are reconciled is one of the most moving things I've ever seen.
Oh, amazing.
In addition to Sentimental Value, I would also highly recommend The Secret Agent, the Brazilian film about the years that they spent under their fascist occupation. It's a truism that history doesn't always echo, but sometimes it rhymes. And that movie will, if you stay with it, it's immensely rewarding. And I think how you feel about it will maybe give you some ideas about how to feel about what's going on now.
I have just a couple of recommendations. Hard to follow that list, but I will recommend Fellow Travelers by Thomas Mallon. Folks have probably heard me talk about this book before. I had the great opportunity to interview Thomas for the Seattle Opera recently because it was made into an opera after the book came out. So when you said that the Yankee Sphinx was going to be a play, it immediately made me think of Fellow Travelers, about the Lavender Scare. It's also fictionalized, but obviously surrounding very real events, very real people as characters. It's beautiful. I cried like a baby at the end.
Oh, wow. That sounds great.
And the opera's incredible. It hit the stage here in Seattle for the first time in over a decade, I think. And I'm stealing this from an interview I did recently with Tom Nisley, who owns Finney Books. And don't worry, Tom, we're going to have you on the show to talk about this. Something he said he loves is selling older books, not just the hot new thing. So I'll recommend reading older books from a decade ago or more. You were talking about the great philosophers, or even just a few years ago. I think that can give us a really interesting window into what was going on around us at the time when these works came out. Maybe it gives us a better window into how we're feeling now. And look, there's too many books to read every single year. Sometimes you got to go back and pick up something you missed. Well, Mark, this has been absolutely lovely. Thank you so much for coming today.
It was a great conversation. It was really a pleasure. Thanks, Katie.
Mark Frost, author of The Yankee Sphinx and many other fantastic works. Thank you for listening to Meet Me Here. Meet Me Here is produced by KUOW, a proud member of the NPR network. It's hosted by me, Katie Campbell, Dyer Oxley, and Jeannie Yandel, and it's produced by Brandy Fullwood, Kyle Norris, and Matt Martin. Our editor is Phyllis Fletcher. You can find more and support the show at kuow.org/meet.
Support comes from Seattle Rep, presenting the return of The Play That Goes Wrong, back by popular demand this June. This award-winning comedy follows the Cornley Drama Society as their production unravels with missed cues, collapsed scenery, and onstage mishaps. Performances begin June 11th on the Bagley Wright stage. Tickets and information at seattlerep.org.
The Seattle food scene has some pretty good low-cost options, but when you factor in quality, quantity, and the overall vibe of a dining experience, what food in town actually gives you the most for your money? I'm Brandy Fullwood, host of Seattle Eats, and on the latest episode, we plug into the meals around town offering great quality for a better price.
Because I can tell you a $30 steak is a good deal. You got to do some math in your head.
Listen to Seattle Eats on the KUOW app or wherever you get your podcasts.